Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to my talk this afternoon. I have quite a lengthy title for this talk, and it's a bit of a mouthful, so I decided I was going to call it something slightly different. So I'm going to call it Little Things Matter. Okay? I'm going to try and make it interesting this afternoon for you. I realize that right now, it's the point that you get to in the afternoon where you really need a coffee. Unfortunately, the coffee is really not ready for you yet. So I'm going to try and make it interesting for you and have a little bit of fun with this, whilst at the same time trying to get some useful points across to you. So what I'd like to do is to do a little bit of background first, and look at some user adoption stories, not necessarily in our industry, to see what we can gain from those. We'll have a look to see what's required for user adoption and the factors that impact that, and also we'll look at how we might get user adoption for large-scale rollouts globally. This is applicable really not just to large-scale rollouts globally of technology like Alfresco, but smaller scale rollouts as well within organizations that have potentially hundreds and thousands of users. And the final thing I'm going to leave you with is the 5 rules of user adoption. So, I haven't been able to find out why projects succeed. Nobody writes about this. Okay? Everybody writes about why projects fail. And it's easy to find out statistics on this, and you've probably seen these before. This is a magazine article out of IBM Systems magazine, and it tells us that most projects fail because of project management reasons. So things like the wrong project governance, the wrong scope, overrunning, those kind of things. They rarely fail for technical reasons. So the question with this is, where does user adoption sit in all of this? So if I look at the figures behind this and what they actually mean and what they're surveying for, business relates to not the business of user adoption and people, but actually things like the project budget and overruns of that type. People relates to people on the project. So I'm starting to think, well, where does user adoption actually fit in any of this in actually not helping projects succeed? And really it's around 2 things for me. User adoption is around the project management and governance and getting that right. And also, it's around people. So we'll talk a little bit more about those things. Anybody recognize this? It's a salesman. So one of the things that you saw on the previous graph was the technical bit is 3%. So projects don't fail, by and large, because of a technical thing. So you've been sold something by the salesman. If you've been sold something by the salesman, don't say it's going to fail because of something technical, because the salesperson is there selling you something and all they've got is a hammer. Okay? And to them, everything looks like a nail. So your problem is going to be solved by the system they're trying to sell you. Okay? It's not their fault. It's not a technical thing. Just a bit of humor for you. So what about using Alfresco? Using Alfresco is actually a good thing. And why is using Alfresco a good thing? It's a good thing because it's what's called a commercially off-the-shelf software. And one of the things that we find, if I look to this in the Financial Times recently, there's a big article in the Financial Times, and my presentation's got all these references in it, that relates to why big IT projects don't work. And one of the elements in it here talks about an auditor's office report that was done in Texas that shows that if you use commercially available, commercially off-the-shelf technology, you're less likely to fail. So Alfresco is that kind of thing. So it helps you to get further and more likely to succeed. Here's another example of another project that actually didn't go very well for the BBC. And if you kind of look into it, there's a number of different things. But in May 2013, this digital media initiative was slated by the government in the UK and also the media and everybody else because they tried to build something from scratch that actually you could have done with commercially available software by integrating it together. So their idea was to build something that was a production tool accessible to everybody, to allow people to access raw footage and to edit it. And one of the things that the system was supposed to do was to provide an archive. So rather than going for something like Alfresco, which is out of the box, they decided they were going to build it all from scratch. So in the end, they spent 115 million euros and they failed. So that was not a good thing. Anybody recognize this guy? This is John Newton, the founder, one of the founders of Alfresco. Yeah, okay. So what's this got to do with Alfresco? Well, right now, not a lot, but bear with me. Let's look at some stories. Stories of technology adoption. So the first one I want to look at is the telephone, which I'm sure all of you recognize. But at some point, before our time, the telephone was new technology. And somehow it had to get adopted. The adoption of this technology by end users is a key thing. And even if the technology is good, unless the user adoption story works with it, then it's not going to work. It's not going to be successful. Alexander Graham Bell was the first person to be awarded a patent for the electronic telephone in 1876 by the USPTO. Incidentally, USPTO also an Alfresco customer. That's got nothing to do with this. They tried to sell it. They tried to sell the idea of the telephone to the UK, the Americans. And this is what the chief engineer of the British Post Office said. Okay, you can read that. So the British don't have any needs of telephones because we've got all these messenger boys. How many of you have a messenger boy in your pocket today? Okay, everybody's got a telephone, a mobile phone. How did they get that adoption? Once they decided to actually go into business with the telephone, they did a number of different things. See? Told you. Somebody's got that messenger. They did a number of different things. The first thing that they did was they actually went round and they put telephones on counters in diners. Okay? And the reason for that is people would go to diners, go for lunch, they'd actually see the telephone being used. So this is one of the first takeaways for you. That's observational learning, watching other people use the system. Other things they did was they replaced intercoms in offices. By that stage, there were electric intercoms in offices. So what they did was they took those electric intercoms and they replaced them with telephones. What that was doing was allowing people to use new technology in a way they were already familiar with. Okay, so they're already used to using the intercom. Now they're using new technology in a slightly different way. And the last thing I'm talking about here is that they also put it into hotels. They put the technology into hotels, and they got people in hotels to start using the telephones to call the front desk, and thus become used to it. So it was all quite clever things that they did to get people used to this new technology. This is a rather old picture. Anybody recognize this? Somebody nodding their head. This is actually my first experience of email was on one of these terminals. And just to give you an idea of how long ago that was, that's what I looked like then. So this was a long time ago, and it wasn't easy to use email. Okay, this type of thing, you would go into email, and it would sit there, and it was like a MS-DOS prompt. You'd say mail. Okay, now what do? There's no buttons to compose new email. There's no send. You had to actually get your way around the system. And most of the time, we didn't actually get trained on this. So that's my favorite command at the time that used to get used a lot by salespeople. Sorry, guys, if you're salespeople. What they would do is they'd go, oh, I remember this one, print all their emails. So you'd get all of your emails on, come out on the printer, and then they'd go through them, and they'd call people up, but they wouldn't actually use the email system. So that wasn't a very good start to the adoption of email. However, the thing about email is that if you weren't on it, you were nobody. Okay? Eventually, it got to a point where everybody was using email because everybody was using email. Okay? So the user adoption takeaway there is if you can get your peers using the technology, then the rest of the community is likely to use it. And my final story here is of the music player. Why is this interesting in terms of user adoption? Well, this is getting closer now to what most people will remember here. When the iPod came out, I think it was 2001. This is really where the resurgence for Apple started before the iPhone. Was with the iPod. There were MP3 music players out there already, but actually they weren't selling very well, and they weren't really getting adopted. So what made the iPod different? Okay, so one thing that made it different was it was actually what I termed the whole product. It actually did everything. It wasn't something like those old MP3 players from Rio and Creative, where you've got that and then you got this other bit of software and you had to actually put the things together yourself. And if you managed to get it to work, then that was great, but you had to be a techie to do it. This actually did everything. You had iTunes, you had the music player, you had the connection, and it just kind of worked. So it was integrated, and it was simple to use, really simple to use. And you've heard people talk today about Alfresco and trying to make Alfresco easier to use, and that really is key to user adoption, making things simple to use. So these little things actually do matter to users, to people who are using a system. These small things like simplicity, having something which does everything for them, really does matter. What was the impact of this? Well, so in 2001, when they launched the iPod, by the end of 2001, they'd sold 125,000 iPods. A bit later on, by the end of 2008, they'd sold a few more. In fact, quite a few more. So from 125,000, they went to 54 million in 7 years. That's not bad adoption, you've got to admit. And why is it 2008? Well, actually, because since then, this figure's been going down, and this figure's been going down because everybody's got a smartphone now, and the tendency is to use a smartphone rather than an iPod or MP3 player. Yeah, what's this got to do with Alfresco? Well, when are we going to get to the Alfresco interesting bits? Okay, well, before we get there, let's talk a little bit now about the things that are going to affect user adoption for an ECM type system, ECM type solution. I can break these down into two major categories. One is organizational, and the other is individual. So if we talk about organizational factors first, these are factors which affect user adoption from the perspective of the project. If you're running an IT project, these are the things that you're thinking about that are going to affect the rollout and the user adoption. And they are things like, how complex is the system? If it's complex, then how am I going to make it easier? What kind of training do I have to give people? The size of the user population. Okay, if the size of the user population is large, then how am I going to deal with getting it rolled out? How am I going to get it adopted? What training do I have to give people? That kind of thing. The location of the user base. Are they in one location, multiple locations? Are they in different geographical locations? And the other thing that you have to really think about is the loss of focus on the user. Quite often projects will start off with thinking about the user requirements, and then you kind of just lose the users while you're doing your build and all the kinds of things, and then at the end you think, oh yeah, what about the users? Okay, so that's the kind of thing you think of from an organizational perspective. What you have to remember, though, is that as an individual, somebody who's using your system has got a different set of things that they're thinking about. If this system's being rolled out to them and they're going to be impacted by the system, then the things that will affect them are the perceived usefulness of the system, whether there's any peer pressure to use the system, which we've talked about already, the individual's propensity to change. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Whether or not there's executive support for the system. So if there's no executive support for the system, people are less likely to adopt it. And there's other things as well, not necessarily related to the individual. So again, complexity of the system. How much change do I have to put into my working day to adopt the system? And is it actually going to do the things I want? So those little things matter to me. So I've taken this from something else that some people might recognize. It's from Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm book. It's quite well known now. And it talks about the type of people that you get adopting technology. So what it's saying is that new technology tends to get adopted by people who are innovators. They're either creating the technology here or they're very intimately connected with the technology. Then you've got the early adopters, the ones that pick up the technology quite easily and readily without too much fuss and bother. And then you've got a big chasm in the middle, and then you've got the early majority. These are the bog standard users sit here, and their propensity to be adaptable to change depends on whether they fall into the early majority or the late majority here of adopters. In terms of your system, when you're rolling it out and you think about user adoption, this is the point that you need to think about here. Okay? That's where you've got to focus, because you've got to get to that early majority somehow. You've got to get them to adopt the system. Getting the early adopters in is not too difficult, but actually getting that early majority in is very important. And this is a fairly typical example for adoption of technology. So the other thing that you find that he doesn't actually talk about is actually something like friction here. So if you're trying to get the adoption by that early majority here, you're always going to see some pushback, which is a bit like friction, right? So you've got to think about, how do I overcome that? How do I get people moving in the right direction without too much pushback? how do I get that user adoption? Okay, so just a quick recap then, what we talked about so far. So organizational drivers are not same as the user drivers as far as user adoption is concerned. Organizational drivers are one thing. The user's thinking it from a different perspective of where he's coming from and what's important to them. And users are people. And people like simplicity. They like to have things easy. They learn by watching others, and they like to be part of a group. So you need to, when you're thinking about how do I get this system adopted, you need to think about these things and build them into the user adoption strategy. We've talked about crossing the chasm, and the best products deliver a whole solution. Okay? As we saw with the iPod. So, how many of you here were at the previous session? Nobody? A couple of you, okay. So, just want to ask you a question about your use of email. How many of you use email on a day-to-day basis? Okay, how many of you are lying? So you all use email on a day-to-day basis. Can you keep your hands up just for a little bit longer? How many of you use email only for external communication outside of your organization? No? Okay. So nobody here from Atos Origin. Okay, so let me introduce you to Thierry Breton. A couple of years ago, he joined Atos Origin as a new person. He decided it was too much email. Okay. So he set a target to become a zero email company within 3 years. Okay, that was his goal, and this is what he said. Now, I'm not here to tell you that email is a good thing or it's an evil thing. I'm not making a value judgment here. What I'm saying to you is that if you think about the size of organization that these guys have, they're all over the world as well, would you say this is a challenging user adoption story? It's not going to be easy, is it? Okay. So, have they succeeded? This was 2.5 years ago, I think, something like that. So again, looking back through my back copies of the Financial Times, I actually found an article in March this year where they interviewed some people from Atos Origin, and they actually found that they were starting to be successful in this. Okay, so they haven't reached their 3-year target yet, but they have been able to start using collaborative software internally rather than emails. Now, this is not for external communications necessarily. They're still using emails for those. But internally, they've actually managed to get to a point where during the Olympics, they managed to have a process that used zero email for handling the whole process. So they're making progress. Why do you think they've managed to get this far, even? Any idea what do you think has helped? He's helped because he's the head. He's the executive, right? If he says that, then people will listen. Okay. If this initiative had come from somewhere else in the organization lower down, probably wouldn't have got anywhere close to succeeding. So this is really important. You need to get, for really profound changes in user adoption, you need to get executive sponsorship. Okay, so getting down to some practicalities then. What you have to think about for user adoption is to have a change management program in place. and you need to plan that early. This is actually taken out of the Zaizi methodology for delivering projects. You don't have to worry about the stuff that's covered over. That's some of the other stuff that we do. But one of the things that we have got in here is this thing in the middle, which is change management, and that runs all the way through. It doesn't have a little component at the beginning and a bit at the end. It's something that we work through with customers all through the project, thinking about how you get those users on board and get high user adoption. How do we change their working patterns to fit the new system if that's necessary? How do we improve working patterns? And so on. And it's something that has to be done early. Now, let's talk about a real situation here, a real example from a couple of years ago that I was directing. And this particular project was for a company. You probably can't see the names. The company was called Black Mountain Group. They had an imperative to get better working practices. They were a HR outsourcing company, and they were very manually based on paper, on doing processes by hand. They did actually use email, but they weren't very good at using email, so there were situations where they would actually do the 1980s thing and print out the email, write on it, and then scan it back into the system. Yeah, puzzling, right? So they didn't really have a great set of working practices. So they decided they were going to put in a system which allowed them to improve their working practices and get tighter compliance. Compliance was a big thing in HR because there's quite a lot of regulations around that. They were a global company based in London, headquartered in New York, with an outpost in Singapore. So we had 3 locations here, and they had quite a large user population. So the system that they were going to put in was going to be electronic content management with case management and some scanning to really do the whole thing. Now, what made this really successful, it actually got implemented really quickly with all the things that they were looking for, was that it was led from the top, from the chief executive's office. And all of the board were in on it, and they were all driving this to conclusion. There was subject matter involvement from all 3 locations, so everybody was in. There was involvement from all the places where there were users. So we didn't get to a point where it was only the people in New York driving the system. There were people from Singapore involved as subject matter experts, and there were people from London involved as subject matter experts contributing to the system. Whilst this was going on, there was a communications strategy, again, led from the top, through the project team, out to the users in the different locations, letting them know what was coming and making sure that they all were aware of the changes that were going to impact them. And of course, the last piece was the training. So there was quite a lot of training that went on, and I'll come back to this point again in just a moment. So the challenges for global adoption are cultural ones. So if you've got people in places as diverse as Singapore and New York, what are the cultural differences that you might have to think about? How will you approach the people in the 2 locations differently, 2 or 3 or whatever they happen to be? Time zones can be a problem if you're trying to arrange things like training sessions. And language is also something that you may need to consider for a global adoption. So the most important thing is when you're doing that change management planning from the beginning to end, that you put in a communications plan that deals with how you're going to touch those various users and tell them what's going on and how the system is going to affect them. And make sure that people are enlisted from across the globe for a global rollout. Okay. So the little things do matter and help for user adoption. Sometimes just one little thing can actually stop wide-scale adoption. So, for example, if it takes too many keystrokes to do something, if the new system misses a small but frequently used feature, it can not get properly adopted. There was a good example in the previous presentation in this room. They were talking about a product they've developed that works with Alfresco for email integration. And that's one of the things that they were saying is that sometimes if users are using email in a big way and it's not integrated with Alfresco, it's actually hard. There's a big friction point getting them to use Alfresco with their email to save attachments and things if it's not easy to do. So that's an example of the system missing out something small but significant. And sometimes the system just neglects some small part of the population. Okay? In one example here, we see this BlackBerry, and unfortunately the system didn't work on BlackBerries, but the executive staff all used BlackBerries. So if the executive staff are not using the system, why should anybody else use the system? So again, user adoption was very difficult in that case because we're not getting the executives using it and pushing the system. Sometimes the product you're using actually just falls a bit short and doesn't really get to where it needs to be because of those little things. So there are things that are going on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Alfresco finally. Okay, how do we make Alfresco life better? Well, Alfresco are doing a number of things to make life better for adoptability, to make user adoption easier. One of the things, if you haven't seen it already, is the new user interface in Alfresco 4.2. It's a much improved user interface, so that will certainly help. Easy records management with 2.1 to make records management easier to use for the general user population, whereas before records had to be moved into the file plan. Now they can be declared from where they are, again making it much easier for people to use. It's not the whole story. There are other things in there. So we've worked on a number of different things to make Alfresco life easier and to make it better. We've improved search in a number of different scenarios and places to put in things like faceted search for users, to put in auto-completion, to put in spelling checks. And all of those things actually are little, but they mean a lot to the user. Other things we've done is to put in things that help with site control. So if you've used share with sites, you know that anybody can create sites and people can delete them and all kinds of things. So we've actually done some work to put in some site controls on there so that people can create sites, but they just have to go through a quick approval process before that. We've done other things like just removing the delete button so people can't delete sites. Because that actually helps, because if somebody leaves the organization and decide they're going to delete a site, then that's it. That site's gone with everything in it. And if they're a manager, then you've kind of lost that. We've done other little things like lightbox selectors, so people can look at a whole range of different documents and select them as if they're a lightbox and put them onto a lightbox and then do some operations on the whole thing. We've implemented shortcuts so that, again, you can have links between folders, document appearing in multiple different places in the folder structure. And we've done some work to make records management even easier. So we've linked it in with collaboration sites in Share, so that now people, when they declare a record, that's already linked into the file plan, so we don't even have to use the rules for records administrators to actually declare those records. And we've done some other things which are much bigger. Okay, this is my sales pitch here for Zaizi. We've done some things that are much bigger. They don't necessarily help user adoption, but they are key to an organization. So for example, we've implemented something called protective markings, and that allows you to designate documents as things like confidential, commercial in confidence, personnel, those kind of things, and actually have security based on those protective markings. So with all of these things, you can get your system up to where it needs to be. So I'm going to tell you 5 rules of user adoption. You'll forget one of them when you leave because you can only ever remember 4 things, apparently, easily. So I'm giving you far too much to remember here. Okay, so plan early, involve users, make sure that they're part of the process early, but make sure also that those users are involved all the way through and that you get communication out to the user base that's going to be impacted. Think about the whole product. What do they need? What is it they need? What's going to make their life bearable with this new system? Is it actually going to work? Is it going to do the whole thing for them, or is it only going to do part of what they need? We talked about executive sponsorship being key to getting stuff rolled out. One of the things that we like to try and do is to train the executive sponsors early. Okay? So if we can get them enthused about the system, and training doesn't mean that they have to use the system really, really well. They just have to be enthused about the system. They have to go out there, they have to talk to people and say, yeah, I've seen the system. Actually, yeah, I know how to upload a document. If you can get executive sponsors to do that, that's great. And train before deployment. Make sure you get some training during and after. Now, for large deployments, one of the issues becomes, or one of the challenges, is if you've got thousands of users, how do you hit thousands of users with training easily? And so the way to approach that is to start thinking about using short video clips, providing some computer-based training, and you can do that. Using that approach means you can train people before, during, and after you're deploying, and that training is available even afterwards if somebody needs to go back and look at it. So those small little video clips are key for achieving that. And the final thing is communicate all that out to the user base so that they know what's going on. Okay, so one of the things we're doing right now with a customer, we're through this process. We haven't reached the end yet. We're going through the user adoption process, and we're building a teaser trailer for them so that they can send that out to the user population, and the user population can start to get motivated about the system. What's it going to do for them? It's only going to be 2 minutes long, so they can watch it relatively easily and quickly, and they can start to get some feel for the system and get excited about the system. I also need to tell you that there were no dachshunds harmed during this presentation creation, which actually makes my little dog very happy. So thank you very much, and I don't know if there's time for questions or not.
Hi. When the change cannot involve the top management, when you have a massive change, what would be your recommendation for this?
So can you repeat the question?
Yeah, if you have a massive change.
Massive change, yeah.
Yeah, like you mentioned for Atos. How do you do this if you cannot just involve your top management?
If you can't involve top management?
Yeah, if you have any recommendation for this.
To be honest with you, I don't think you can do it if you haven't got top management buy-in. I think it's it's going to be very, very hard to get a system adopted that involves massive change. I'll give you a couple more quick examples here of conversations I've had with people recently. One organization I'm working with is actually a government organization. They can't use the word mandatory in front of training. Okay? They don't want to do that because that will alienate the user population. Conversation with another government agency, which is actually a different type of government agency, which are involved in security, and they say, that's easy for us. People just use the system or they leave. Okay? Because when you're talking about security, they have to use those systems. They can't use Dropbox for information that's sensitive and official. Okay? So they have to use the system or they leave. So for them, it's easy. People will do the training. They will use the system. But if you haven't got that kind of impetus in an organization, you really need the top management to buy into the system and to help you push it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shubham.
Hi.
Have you had instances where the adoption for your customers started well and you did your planning right, and then it went into a long pause, a kind of a really sluggish pace? And in that situation, were you able to revive that adoption back?
Right. So I know what you're.
So basically, what I'm saying is that a lot of initial efforts that go
Yes.
into the adoption get the momentum,
Yes.
but then there is a sluggishness that kind
Yes.
of comes into the whole experience. And
Indeed.
then have you actually
Yeah.
revived that?
It's actually quite hard when it gets like that. So what I try and do right at the beginning is to find for the organization, see if working with them I can find a compelling event, something that is happening in the future that really requires them to have the system implemented and rolled out, and try and get their minds focused on that compelling event. Sometimes it's really easy, like an organization is moving to a new building. Okay, and they haven't got enough filing space in the new building. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to scan some of those documents. You're going to have to scan incoming post and deliver it via workflow. That building is going to be built on a certain date. It's ready for people to move in, so the project will be finished then. When you've got that kind of compelling event, that's really easy and brilliant. If you don't have that, it can tend to creep out, but that's really where, as a project manager, you've got to kind of reel it back in and make sure that things are getting done. Thank you.